Hi, this is Dr. Greg Jicha. I'm an MD-PhD here at the Sanders Brown Center on Aging. And you've all come in today to learn a little bit more about the genetics of Alzheimer's disease, specifically focusing on the role of the major risk gene in aging and risk for Alzheimer's, which is the ApoE4 gene. So, what about those genes? And again, we're not talking about those blue genes, but instead, these blue genes are chromosomes, genes that are on our chromosomes that code for who we are and what our body does, including our risk for diseases versus health. And the same holds true for the brain. Now, genetics do play a role in Alzheimer's disease. And from what we can tell, the genetic risk of Alzheimer's runs about 50%, with another 50% or so related to environmental risks. And that's very important because we can alter many of our environmental risks, but we can't change our genes. So, really, really important. Now, there are some rare forms of Alzheimer's disease that can be related to what we call autosomal dominant genes. So, in the example here, we see a mother and a father, and the father is affected. You can see their gene in white affected here, and an unaffected mother. And this type of genetics is inescapable. And so dad will pass down his gene to one out of every two of his children. And we can see in the diagram that two of his children receive the gene and both become affected by the disease. This is true for some rare forms of Alzheimer's, but again, there are only about 500 families worldwide affected by this type of Alzheimer's disease. The onset is predictable. It's typically at a very young age in their 40s or 50s. And this is important for us to understand because it really doesn't apply to the vast majority of us who develop Alzheimer's. But what we've learned from some of those genes is that all of these types of mutations work by increasing amyloid production in the brain. So they either focus on the amyloid precursor protein, or they involve the enzymes that create the beta amyloid from the amyloid precursor gene. So, the likelihood that you have true genetic Alzheimer's disease or a risk for true genetic Alzheimer's disease is virtually none. If you have a family history that shows less than one half of every generation with AD has Alzheimer's disease, and if you don't have the onset of Alzheimer's disease in your 40s or 50s, but instead above the age 60. What might you have instead? Well, it might just be sporadic Alzheimer's disease. And this becomes incredibly common as we age, but it also could be related to having a risk gene. So let's talk about risk genes. Risk genes create what's called an incomplete penetrance. And so here we have a diagram, and squares are the men and circles are the women. And if you're bright red, you are affected by the disease and carry that risk gene. So in this, we can see that great grandpa had Alzheimer's and carries a risk gene. And he passed down that risk gene to two of his children, a son who is shown in pink. That's the pink square in the second row. And while he acquired the risk gene, never came down with Alzheimer's disease. On the other hand, great grandpa's daughter, the red circle, not only inherited the risk gene, but actually developed Alzheimer's. We look at successive generations and we see that if you carry the risk gene, even if you don't have the disease, you can still pass on the risk gene and the likelihood for Alzheimer's to a child. So the son passes it on to the grandson who gets the disease. The daughter passes the gene on to her daughter, who doesn't get Alzheimer's, but who passes on that gene to the great grandson who gets not only the risk gene but develops Alzheimer's. Now, this is not like witchcraft. It does not skip every other generation, but instead shows us that risk genes increase the likelihood for Alzheimer's, but they don't actually cause Alzheimer's, and you can have a risk gene and never get Alzheimer's disease. So, when we're talking about risk genes, the major risk gene for Alzheimer's disease is called the ApoE gene. And the ApoE gene comes in three different types. It comes as an E2, an E3, or an E4. And in the general population, about 15%, one out of every six people, carry the E4 risk gene for Alzheimer's disease. Now we can see in an Alzheimer population, about 38% of the Alzheimer population carry this risk gene. But if you don't have this risk gene, 62% still get Alzheimer's disease. And so again, it is a gene that's going to influence your risk, but it is not a determinant of whether you absolutely will get Alzheimer's or not. So what do we know about ApoE? Well, it's a cholesterol trafficking protein, very important for brain health. And if you get a copy of the E4 variant of ApoE, you will be at higher risk for Alzheimer's, meaning you might get it at an earlier age, typically still above the age of 60, and you may be more likelihood to get it. Nowadays, this has become very, very important because it may affect the risks and or benefits of different medicines that we use for Alzheimer's disease. We do know that if you get one copy of the ApoE4 gene, you're 4 times more likely to develop Alzheimer's. But if you get two copies, one from mom and one from dad, you may be 10 times more likely to get Alzheimer's disease. And again, the risk gene is working through increasing the likelihood that you will build up amyloid in your brain, eventually leading to Alzheimer's disease. So again, the ApoE gene comes in three types, an E2, an E3, or an E4. And so you could have one of 6 different combinations. Those are the only possibilities. You could be an E2-2, an E2-3, an E2-4, an E3-3, an E3-4, or an E4-4. Very important to understand this. And so today, you may be here to learn your ApoE test results. And this may help you understand your future risk for Alzheimer's disease or mild cognitive impairment due to Alzheimer changes. Now, before we go further, we should stop and talk about genetic disclosure in general. There are certainly some things we should consider that are important when you know your genetic status. You should be thinking about your family because your genetics may be related to their genetics. You also need to understand your emotional response. What if you learn that you're at 10 times the risk for Alzheimer's or 4 times the risk for Alzheimer's? Will you be able to manage that? And certainly, keeping this information secure is important, as there could be implications for your insurance, long-term or disability insurance, as well as your employment. And so not everybody wants to know their ApoE gene, and there is no right or wrong answer to this. Only you can decide what is right for you. So we think about the family and we think about the potential impact. Well, if I carry the risk gene, then one out of every two of my children may have that risk gene. What about my siblings? If I have a risk gene, then they have a one out of two chance or a 50% chance of also carrying a risk gene. But this could extend to other blood relatives. Your genes are not going to affect your spouse or partner, but their understanding of your future risk will be affected, and this could be important as well. Certainly, thinking about your emotional state. If you find out you don't have a risk gene, well, you may be relieved by that. But if you find out you do carry a risk gene, that knowledge could enable you to empower yourself to really embrace control of the environmental risk factors that you can exert some control over and work a little bit harder to lower your risk. We are always worried about possible negative emotional reactions, depression, anxiety, guilt. And so we do need to be cognizant of these and to be thinking about these impacts. Now, there can be some financial and or medical care implications of learning your ApoE status, your genetic phenotype, and this needs to be protected. And so there is a federal law in the United States called GINA, the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. And this protects against genetic discrimination for health insurance and employment. Again, this will not cover life insurance or long term disability policies, and also doesn't cover employment if you work in small workplaces, those with 10 or fewer employees. And so, very, very important. What GINA allows you to do is if you decide to learn your ApoE genetic status today, and people in the future ask you if you are aware of any genes or genetic status that predispose you to Alzheimer's or other conditions, you essentially can lie to them and say, no, you are not aware of any, and you are perfectly within your rights under the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act to not share that information. And typically, we recommend that people do not share this information or place this in their medical record unless there is a strong need to do so and you have sought out genetic counseling. So, we're going to take a look at some ApoE risk estimate summary sheets. These are not your personal results, but your results may fall into one of these categories. So most people in the world, about 60%, three out of every five, have two copies of the E3. And that means an average risk for Alzheimer's, neither increased nor decreased. And so when we look at that, we know that your risk, if you have two copies of the E3, is about 10 to 15% to get Alzheimer's in the future, or conversely, about 85 to 90% chance you will not come down with Alzheimer's. If you carry two copies of the E2 gene, this may actually lower your risk for Alzheimer's disease, but could change your risks for other disorders as well. This is a very rare genotype present in only 1 to 2% of the population. But if you have this, your risk for Alzheimer's may be lower than that 10 to 15%. The same with an E2, E3. There may be a slightly lower risk of Alzheimer's disease, but again, how low that risk is, we don't know. And many folks with an E2, E3 can still come down with Alzheimer's disease. Now, an E2, E4 means your 2 is lowering your risk for Alzheimer's, but your 4 is increasing your risk for Alzheimer's disease. And so when we look at this, we are uncertain of the overall risk, but we suspect expect that the risk may be around average, around the same risk of an E3, E3 at about 10 to 15%. Now, if you have an E3, E4, this is a situation where your risk for Alzheimer's is going to be 4 times greater than somebody with 2 copies of the E3. And that means that your risk of developing Alzheimer's in the future is going to be approximately 20 to 25%. Now, that may dismay you, but again, cup half empty, cup half full. Your risk of not developing Alzheimer's remains quite high at 75 to 80%. So having the risk gene should empower you to work a little bit harder on your other Alzheimer's risks, but is in by no means an absolute indicator of developing Alzheimer's. Some folks can have an E4, E4, and this means 2 copies of the risk gene for Alzheimer's and an overall risk that's probably 10 times higher for Alzheimer's than if you carried an E3, E3. And we look at that risk and we see that your risk of developing Alzheimer's is probably about 50%, but your risk of not developing Alzheimer's remains around 50%. So again, not good news if this is your ApoE genotype, what your genes show. But again, 50% of your Alzheimer's risk may be in your hands to control through modifying your environmental risk factors. So again, these are risk genes, and the lowest risk would be somebody who carries an E2, E2. Mid-risk is somebody who carries an E3, 3. And the highest risk are for those who carry a copy of the E4 without a protective E2 gene. We also look at that risk over time. And so we know that that risk is driven by the ApoE status, but also driven by age. So what we've presented to you today is a review of up-to-date information on ApoE risk. And so your individual situation may vary on the basis of other genetic or environmental risks, and that's important to understand. So let's talk about those possible modifiers of your risk. If you found out that you do have a risk gene for Alzheimer's disease, well, let's take a look at what else could increase your risk. Well, just that general family history of dementia or Alzheimer's, irrespective of whether it was related to ApoE4, is an increase for your risk. The older you get, the more you're at risk. More women than men come down with Alzheimer's, so being a woman, unfortunately, might increase your risk, although part of that is driven by the fact that women live longer than men on average. Fewer years of education. That can be a risk for Alzheimer's. And so keeping your brain stimulated and active is incredibly important to try to lower that risk. Other cardiovascular conditions such as diabetes, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, get these under control, lower that environmental Alzheimer's risk. Really important. What we're really striving for is keeping your brain active, more years of education or mental activity, and good cardiovascular health. So when we talk about healthy brain aging, reducing your risk for Alzheimer's, we're really talking about heart health. Heart health is brain health. For all intents and purposes, we want to make sure we're exercising every day, 20 to 30 minutes, at least 3 days a week. We want to eat a heart-healthy diet. The Mind diet, the Mediterranean diet, that doesn't mean couscous and falafel. It means rich in fruits and vegetables, low in red meat. Sure, you can have a steak or a filet every now and then, but not every day. Reduce your stress. Quit smoking, take care of that blood pressure, diabetes, cholesterol, and importantly, engage in social and mentally stimulating activities. Here are a variety of websites that you can reach out to if you'd like to learn more. The Alzheimer's Association, the National Institutes of Health Genetic Home Reference, the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, and other resources at the National Institutes on Aging and the Institute of Medicine. We do know there are many other genes, and this is what's called the Manhattan plot. It looks like the skyline of New York City. All of these genes can influence your risk for Alzheimer's. We're working on understanding all of that because they do potentially implicate new areas that we can target to prevent and or treat the disease. But again, ApoE is your biggest risk as a risk gene. What we have learned about the other genes is that they're involved in several different aspects of brain and nerve cell health. Many are involved in cholesterol trafficking. So, again, keeping that cholesterol under control and eating a healthy diet is very important. Reducing inflammation, reducing stress, very, very important. Keeping up synapses, the connections between nerve cells by exercising your brain, incredibly important. And even brain development has been implicated. So please, once you understand your ApoE genetic status, use this in a positive fashion. Begin to influence your environmental risks, reduce those risks. We're working towards a day where no one ever comes down with Alzheimer's. But until that point, let's gain knowledge. Let's understand our individual risks and work as hard as we are to reduce those risks and maintain healthy brain aging as we age. Thank you all. And if you have questions, please reach out to us at the center for more information.